In the last lesson, we learned some vocabulary words for integers and the number line, and what we're going to be learning in these next couple of lessons. One of the things we learned was that integers can be negative numbers, like -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and so on, and they go on in either direction. And we also learned what an absolute value is. Absolute value. Now, what an absolute value, just as a reminder, is it's the distance away from 0, and it's notated with two vertical lines. So the absolute value of 2, well, the distance away from 0 of -2 would be 2. The absolute value of -2 is 2. And on a number line, if you have 0, -1, -2, we can see that the distance away from 0 is 1, 2. And the same thing's true about +2. If you have a +2, the distance away from 0 is 1, 2. So you can also say the absolute value of 2 is 2, equals 2. Okay, so what are some real-life examples of integers, or of negative integers in particular? Well, when you're talking about temperature, you could have a temperature of 30 below 0. Now, some parts of the world don't ever get that cold, but some parts do. And 30 below 0, and it doesn't matter if we're talking Celsius or Fahrenheit or some other form of temperature. But if we say the temperature is 30 below 0, then an integer that could represent that would be a -30. -30, and that would be 30 below 0. Now, another real-world example could be altitude. Some places in the world are, well, you measure it compared to sea level. So you have the ocean, and you have mountains. Mountains would be above sea level. But then you could have land and then a valley that goes below sea level. So if this is the sea, if that's the sea, you could have a valley that's below sea level. Below sea level. And we would measure that as a negative integer. And it would be negative, well, however far below sea level, or the surface of the sea, would be. So below sea level, let's say, well, Death Valley, for instance, it's one of the lowest places in the world, and it's actually 282 feet below sea level. 282 feet below sea level. And we can use an integer, a negative integer, to represent that. We would say it's -282 feet below sea level. So -282 feet would be Death Valley. Okay, so that's, and then if we wanted to say, well, what's the absolute value of -282? So what's the distance between the bottom of this valley and the sea? What's the distance? How many feet are there? Well, remember, absolute value is the distance away from 0. So if the sea represents 0, what's the distance from, and we can draw that over here, what's the distance between the bottom of Death Valley and the sea? Well, absolute value, 282, that's just the distance away from 0, and you measure distances in positive. So the absolute value of -282 would equal 282. Okay, so that's the absolute value, and you can write it this way. The absolute value of -282 is +282. because you measure distance in positive. Okay, let's look at some inequalities. And that was also a term that was introduced in the last lesson. So let's use inequalities to compare some numbers. Let's compare 14 and 7. Okay, well 14 is greater than 7. So we use the inequality greater than. And a reminder, that symbol is greater than. Greater than. And we have less than. And then there's a couple more symbols. We have greater than or equal to, greater than or equal to. And we also have less than or equal to. Less than or equal to. And some examples, we'll get into some real life examples of when you would use greater than or equal to and less than or equal to. But for this lesson, let's just compare some numbers. So 14 is greater than 7. Let's compare two more numbers. Let's compare 11 and -2. Okay, and picture these on a number line. If you have 0, -1, -2, and then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 11 right here. Now compare those two. Well, remember, if it's farther right, it's going to be greater than. Oh, whoops. And farther left is less than. So how does 11 compare with 2? Well, 11 is farther right, so 11 would be greater than -2. Let's try a couple more. Let's do -15 and -5. Okay, now we have two negative numbers, but remember the one farthest to the right is going to be the larger one. And I'll draw another number line down here. And I'm not going to put all the details on here, but you have 0, then -1, 2, 3, 4, 5. -5 is there. And then you have to go some more to get to -15. Okay, so you have -5 and -15. Well, which one's farther right? Well, the farthest one to the right is the -5. So that's going to be the larger of the two. The -5 is the farthest to the right. So we want the little alligator thing or the inequality to be eating the larger one. Okay, so and the arrow, if you think of it as an arrow, it's going to point to the smaller one. And the smaller one, remember, is the one farthest to the left. So we would read this as -15 is less than -5. And we don't have time for another example, but in the next lesson, we'll show some more examples and explore a little bit more with absolute value and comparing integers.